I wanted to take just a few minutes to get everybody to look at the landscape of housing in Montgomery County, because it's actually far worse than anybody thinks. We've been pretty much unwilling to talk about what's actually happening here, but I think we're in really serious trouble. And it's really problematic that it's gone as far as it has, because it's created a really deep hole that impacts how we're going to be able to retain a workforce in this area as well. In the long term, unless we're willing to do some things that are more far-reaching than what we've done so far, we're going to have a difficult time meeting our affordable housing challenges. I looked at the HAND report, which surveyed the state of affordable housing in the region, and the report was not good news, because basically nobody is able to build affordable housing for the people who need it most. So HAND's conclusion was that affordable housing is not being built, particularly deeply affordable housing. And that's a problem, because everybody in the region signed on to these obligations or promises, yet no one has changed their policies in a way that would make achieving them possible. I don't know how one deals with a problem without first analyzing it and making decisions where your solutions will actually address the problem. I was on the council for 12 years, and it's alarming to look at the data on MPDUs, moderately priced dwelling units, because this program is held up as a national model, and yet we only have 6,700 units remaining from a 40-year-old program. That's a very small amount in a county of 1.1 million people, particularly when you have tens of thousands of people spending 50 to 60% of their incomes on housing and not getting any support. The MPDU was designed for a very different time. And as the county changed, the program did not. Originally, it was referred to as a program for teachers, firefighters, and policemen. Our needs have gotten much deeper, extend below those income levels and slightly above those income levels. I don't have an easy solution, but I do have ideas on what we need to do. But I think it's necessary to show the landscape of the county so that we can start thinking about what we need to do and how to address these problems through a better understanding of the nature and the scope of the problem. I use the following slides to help put the county's housing problem in perspective, and then I'm going to talk about what I think needs to be done to solve the problem. I'd like to talk to you about Montgomery County's affordable housing crisis and why the policies we have don't work. I've titled this presentation, "When Wishful Housing Policy Collides with Reality." So this slide shows the landscape of who lives in today's multifamily units in the county. It's shown in the top part, current households by area median income. And as you can see, there's about 31,000 people who earn between 0 and 30% of area median income, AMI, about 25,000 households cost burden, and about 22,800 severely cost burden. For households between 31 and 50%, you've got about 19,000 total, 15,000 cost burden, 6,600 severely cost burden. In households earning between 51 and 65%, you've got about 15,000 households, 13,000 cost burden, 700 severely cost burden. Of people with incomes between 66 and 80%, you have about 9,000 households with 2,800 of them cost burden. And of people earning over 80% of AMI, you're looking at about 56,000 households and 11,200 who are cost burden. The totals show that you'd have about 40,000 cost burden households, of which 29,400 are severely cost burdened. Of the new households arriving by 2030, this is the discussion about, are we going to be able to house people by 2030? We've got 40,000 households projected to come. 20,000 of those households would have incomes below 50% of AMI. About 10,000 would have households but have income between 50 and 75% of AMI, and another 10,000 would have incomes over 75% of AMI. But for that last group, the 10,000 over 75%, many of them will not be able to find affordable housing in the county in their price range. In many places, it requires incomes up to 100% of AMI or higher in order to buy the new market rate units. So even many of these folks will not be able to find new market rate units. But in all, if you look at the first two groups, that's 30,000 households who are going to be needing housing support. And the last slide shows the loss of naturally occurring affordable housing in the county over the last now 22 years. Naturally occurring affordable housing are units that are affordable without subsidy. They're not part of HOC, they're not MPDUs. They just exist in the community at rents that are generally considered affordable. In 2000, there were 44 to 45,000 units of this type. Today, less than 23,000. And Park and Planning's projected that we will lose 7 to 11,000 of those units by 2030. So there's a major erosion of affordable housing occurring in the county just right now. This slide just summarizes the existing deficit. About 40,000 currently cost burdened, about 29,000 severely cost burdened. New residents by 2030, 30,000 of them will need supported housing. And by 2030, 7 to 11,000 additional affordable housing units will be lost. This slide shows the mismatch between who's coming to the county and what's in our housing pipeline. The housing pipeline are the number of units that can be built for which there are plans. We know how many units each development's going to have, and we know how many are going to be affordable because we can calculate what the affordable housing requirement is. So from the previous slide, you've got about 40,000 people coming here, 20,000 below 50% of area median income, 10,000 below between 51 and 75%, and households above 75% are about 10,000. Now look at the units in the pipeline. There are 40,000 units in the pipeline. So if you just are worried about building units, we could build 40,000 units based on what's approved right now. We don't need to rezone anything to build these units. But units affordable below 50% of AMI will be zero, other than a few projects where we have some leverage and can get some additional affordability or buy some additional affordability. We will not be producing units. We don't. The nonprofits and the for-profit developers will often not be providing units in this price range. Units affordable to people between 51 and 75% of AMI, we would get about 6,000 units. That's about 15% of the total households that are projected to come here. And then units for households over 75% of AMI, we would be projected to build 34,000 households. And now you can see the mismatch. For households who need affordable housing, we're going to produce 6,000 units thereabouts for 30,000 people. For the market, which appears to demand about 10,000 units, the market potentially could create 34,000 units. Those units aren't going to be built because developers aren't going to build units for people who can't afford to rent the units. So we will be in a serious conundrum of building 40,000 units if the units that we require to be built are different than the units that the market is going to be able to build. We've heard a lot of rhetoric about the need to massively rezone and go into neighborhoods and change the zoning in order to meet the affordable housing needs of this county. And I would say, I'd have no objection to that if that's what we were trying to do. But this chart kind of tells you a very different story. This is from Park and Planning. It's the approved residential projects in the development pipeline as of May 2022. So these are all broken down by master plan areas in the county. But if you go to the project totals, what you're going to see is that the county has about 414 approved projects. Those approved projects consist of 50,000 approved dwelling units. Of the approved dwelling units, there are 35,000 unbuilt, meaning the developers could build these. They're already approved. They're ready to go. They're not being built. So this desperate discussion about the need to rezone stuff because we don't have places to build is kind of undercut by the fact that today people could build 35,000 units here. That doesn't even include all the property for which no plans have ever been submitted, and therefore the yield on those properties is not included in this total. But I point this out because 35,000 unbuilt units is pretty significant, and it goes to other problems other than zoning. As you can see, we don't lack for the places to build. What we lack is the actual building. And that's not a zoning problem. That's related to other things. So this slide is a real-life example of what's seriously wrong with our housing policy in the county. It's an example of what's happening in Bethesda in real time. These two projects actually made it into stories in Bethesda Beat over the last few months. Building 1 has 87 NOAAs, 1 and 2 bedroom affordable units today, no requirements on them. So this development of 87 units is being replaced by a development of 399 units, an addition of 312 units. What the county's getting in return, 60 MPDUs, which is fewer than the number of affordable units we have today. It's a net loss of 27 units. But it gets worse. Project number 2 is several buildings, 477 NOAAs in those buildings. The 1s and 2s are definitely in that category. The 3-bedroom units require higher incomes, around 100 to 110% of area median income, but they are still below what the market is. But these 477 units are going to get replaced by 1,130 units. It's a big difference. However, the county is going to get between 170 and 226 MPDUs out of 1,130 units, which is between 251 and 307 fewer units than we have today. You cannot solve the affordable housing problem if your housing policies allow developers to take massive density increases and benefit from that, and then replace the affordable units with fewer units than exist today, let alone provide any units for future growth that is needed. So why are there so many units in the pipeline that are not being built? Well, the planning board also knows that answer as well. They interviewed developers in White Flint. They looked at potential projects in Silver Spring. And what the developers told the planning department was there are 2 primary reasons for the slow pace of building. First is the lack of jobs that would attract people to move here and seek housing close to where they work. This is the reverse of what Park and Planning is advocating. They're suggesting that housing will be built first and jobs were followed. First place, you're not going to rent or buy a house unless you have a job. So for the new housing that would need to be built, those people need to have jobs. And if they already have jobs, they're not going to stimulate more jobs in Montgomery County. On the other hand, if we do our job and attract more jobs to the county, it will create a demand for more housing. This is why we've been so focused, particularly on high quality jobs in the life sciences, but in jobs in general in the county, in order to make it possible for more people to be able to find housing in the county. And the second issue is construction costs of the product they want to build dictates rents that are simply not affordable for those seeking housing here. Both the Urban Institute and the Planning Department confirm this, and is outlined below. This is a serious issue. The developers, because of the density and trying to maximize their density, the price of that construction is a lot higher than lower density buildings or shorter buildings. Difference between concrete construction and wood construction. It leads to the need for higher rents in order to cover costs and the rate of return that they expect. And they cannot get the rate of return by renting to the households in Montgomery County who need housing, but can't afford to pay the rents that the developers would like to achieve. And so they're sitting on their density and not building, or building very slowly because there aren't enough households out there to are able to pay full market rent for that. And you can see that in the statistics before. If you're only expecting 10,000 market households over a decade, that's around 1,000 market households a year. So it's not a dramatic number of additional demand being added. And so the building of these units goes pretty slowly. It is the real explanation of the slow pace is the lack of demand for the products. If the planning department's projections are correct, the need to provide 40,000 households by 2030 conflicts with only 10,000 of those households being market rate units, and the need for 30,000 affordable units is really the crux of the problem. In the next slide, you're going to see projects that have been built based on current plans. Without rezoning, these units alone would meet the units needed by 2030. We have plenty of zone growth potential, but it doesn't match with the incomes in the county and projected incomes for future residents. This is another look at the May 2022 pipeline. It's again from Park and Planning, not from me. It shows the number of plans that have been submitted actually since 1985, and it shows you what's not been built. And so you can see going back to 95 to 99, there are still 9 plans with 11 units out there that haven't been built. No big deal. A small number between 2000 and 2004, smallish number between 2005 and 2009. But you can see between 2010 and 2014, there's still 53 unbuilt projects, 248 are pure residential, and there are 2,285 units in mixed-use development. Then between 2015 and 2019, there are 105 plans that are approved, 1,367 purely residential units, 9,852 unbuilt dwelling units in mixed-use buildings. And then for 2020 to the present, lest anybody think we're not actually approving anything, in these 2 years actually, we're looking at 108 projects, 3,000 residential unbuilt units, and 14,338. So you get your total of 369 total plans approved, 4,922 residential unbuilt, and 26,691 mixed use unbuilt. The reason this number is smaller than the other one is doesn't include the numbers from Laytonsville, Poolsville, Rockville, or Gaithersburg. Their pipeline data was not included in this by Park and Planning, but it's all real and it's all Montgomery County. And you can see this on the chart over here to get an idea of what our potential is. We do not lack for potential. Our policies today only reinforce these outcomes. We have no policy to require no net loss of existing units and unit-for-unit replacements in all redevelopments. We have no preservation policies other than we try to buy what we can with the funds we have, even though it doesn't meet the need that's out there. We can't possibly buy all the buildings that come up before us with opportunities to purchase because there's simply not enough capital to do that. The county has no way to prevent rents from soaring out of reach, which is what's happening as we speak, unless the county is willing to consider some form of rent stabilization, which so far, other than for emergency purposes, the county is not entertained. We have policies that allow developers to buy out of their affordability requirements with payments that are too low to provide sufficient funds to allow the county to buy an off-site affordable unit in the same policy area. To compound the problem, developers are loading up their high-rises with so many amenities that a tenant who's eligible for an MPDU actually can't afford the condo fees and therefore doesn't qualify for the unit. The equity issues are pretty obvious here, as we allow the creation of what are essentially high-rise vertical gated communities. Next, we only require between 12.5% and 15% of the total number of units to be built as MPDUs. So for every 100 market rate units in a building, we get 13 to 15 affordable units. At that rate, under our current policies, we'd have to build 200,000 market rate units to get the 30,000 affordable that are needed by 2030, 5 times the projected number of new households. It's also twice the projected number of new households by 2045. And this doesn't do anything to provide housing for the people who are already rent burdened and severely rent burdened. And it doesn't take into account housing for the up to 11,000 households who will be displaced by 2030. Our MPDU program doesn't serve lower income households or households really earning above 75% of AMI, but below the price of market units, which usually require incomes of about 100% of AMI. The original MPDU program was designed, as people like to say, for policemen, firemen, and teachers. That's great. And that might have been the landscape of Montgomery County when that program was developed, but it's not the landscape now. We have far too many people with incomes that are lower than what a police officer or a firefighter or a teacher makes, and they don't qualify for these programs. And I know as many young people know, they make more than the eligible income for an MPDU, but they don't make enough to be able to buy market housing. If you're in Bethesda and a one-bedroom market unit in the new buildings costs $2,500 for starters, you're looking at needing $100,000 in income to qualify for that unit. There are a lot of people between 75% of AMI and 100% of AMI who simply don't make enough to buy the market units that are actually being produced. In other words, our policies are designed not to work, and not surprisingly, they don't work. As you can see from the data, the solution that is being proposed of just build more housing doesn't and hasn't worked because it's built on a false premise. It assumes developers will build more housing even if the demand for the units they want to build isn't there. They're not going to build 30,000 market rate units if the market for these units is 10,000 people between 2020 and 2030. And they aren't going to build more affordable units either. Otherwise, it would have happened in this stagnant market. If they built 30,000 market units, according to the county's projections, 20,000 would not be occupied by 2030. No developer is going to do that. Developers aren't going to build market units with all the related costs if there aren't tenants to afford them. If they built the 20,000 deeply affordable units today, which our current zoning would support, they would quickly get filled. But the developers are waiting for when their properties can be used to meet the demand for more expensive and more profitable units in the future, and they're willing to wait. I get it, it's basic economics, but it's not good social policy and not a way to create a community for all. The county was massively upzoned over the past 15 years, but it hasn't resulted in meeting the housing demand, particularly affordable units, nor has it met the desire for additional job growth. Just zoning for more housing, or jobs for that matter, won't change the reality of what will actually get built. Housing policy must focus on meeting identifiable affordability needs. We must change the current MPD requirements to meet the needs of today's residents. MPDUs require 12.5% to 15% of new units to be affordable, between 60 and 75% of AMI. If 40,000 new units are built for the households coming to Montgomery County, we're only going to get about 6,000 MPDUs, not the 30,000 affordable units needed for new households. Nothing will be built for existing cost-burdened households, and nothing will be built to replace the 11,000 existing affordable units we're projected to lose. We need to control the loss of affordable housing, increase lending for production and preservation, increase our rent supports, and increase the level of MPDUs that are required. We need more multi-bedroom units so families can live in these buildings, more units above and below the income groups served by the current MPDU program, more units than the 12.5% to 15% of market units than required today. And absent doing these things, we don't have the tools to provide the housing that our residents need. So what can we do? Adopt rent stabilization on pre-2005 buildings, because by 2025, all the currently required MPDUs in those buildings will expire. Most already have. Second, require a much higher percentage of affordable units, maybe a third of a total development serving a range of incomes between 30 and 100% of AMI. Develop our own properties as soon as possible. We've asked for housing proposals in 18 county-owned parcels, and we'll be reviewing 130 responses that we received to date, which is pretty remarkable. We've seen people responding who've never built here before, so we're encouraged. We need to encourage and support home ownership, enabling tenants to start building equity. Everything can't be rental housing. We need a shift toward providing more opportunities for low and moderate income people to own their housing so they can build equity, so they can take out equity loans and send their kids to school, or do all the other things that those of us who own houses are able to do. Fifth, we need a no net loss policy, period. Every unit demolished due to redevelopment must be replaced with a unit of comparable affordability in the new development. And it would be really useful if we got additional units as well, because just replacing what's there today does not address the need for housing in the future. And that future is coming upon us pretty quickly. Six, invest in new ways of building mid-rises rather than focusing so much on high-rises. It would yield more affordable units and be less costly to subsidize. You could achieve the same density over an area and still have greater affordability. And lastly, we need to work with our partners to develop lower cost methods of construction. There are ways to do this better. We need to continue to look for ways to produce more affordable housing at a more reasonable price.